Welcome to Conversations on the Coast, San Francisco's premier author interview program. And today we're going to talk about a book with an interesting title and an even more interesting subtitle. The title is Oil on the Brain. The subtitle, Adventures from the Pump to the Pipeline. The author who is joining us is Lisa Margonelli. The publisher is Doubleday, and it's a Nene Talese book. Thank you for joining us, Lisa.
Thank you.
Well, this book is, in a way, I think of it as terribly well designed because it begins and it ends in the Twin Peak gas station, a place where I've bought a hell of a lot of gas. I just think it's, so proper and nice and neat that you begin there and you end there. Now, but the thing is that this adventures from the pump to the pipeline really, sent you off 3 years of research, traveled about 100,000 miles, burned 3,000 gallons of some kind of gas or petrol fuel. And you interviewed a lot of people, gas station owners, truckers, drillers, oil billionaires, New York Mercantile Exchange employees, members of the Niger Delta, Iranian workers, Venezuelan villagers, Chinese automobile designers, and folks who worked at the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, and wildcatters like Michael Halberty, okay.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you went nuts with this, Lisa.
I absolutely did. I totally went nuts.
All around the world.
I just got obsessed. It was one of those things, like once I realized that I knew so little about oil, I just had to know one thing, and then that one thing would lead to another thing, and then there I was, 4 years later and many thousands of miles and just absolutely obsessed. And the name of the book, Oil on the Brain, comes from a song from the 1860s when there was a big oil rush in the Pennsylvania hills, and everybody had what they called oil fever or oil on the brain, and there was a song about oil on the brain.
Well,
I felt that's what I had basically from the very beginning.
It's a truism even today, I would guess, huh?
I think so.
Yeah. Now, the other thing is that you also give us in the book not just what's happening right now, you also give us historical perspective. For example, when you do a section or a chapter on Iran, you talk about one of the largest Navy battles the United States has engaged in since World War II took place in Iran.
Right.
Tell us about that. I mean, that totally blew my mind.
It's been really forgotten in the U.S. I think one of the issues about the U.S. and oil is that we don't remember much of the history, but people in Venezuela or Iran are very, very aware of the history. So that's why I felt that the history was very important in the book, although all the action takes place now. In 1988, Iran and Iraq were at war. Iraq had invaded part of Iran, and they had been fighting for about 8 years. It was an incredibly bloody war. The Iranian Revolutionary Guards were mining some parts of the Straits of Hormuz, which was affecting oil tankers going to the U.S. and also going to Europe and other places. And so the U.S. decided, this was Reagan was the president then, they decided to sort of exercise the Carter Doctrine, which had been cooked up in 79 or 80, saying that the U.S. was responsible. Anybody who messed with the oil transport lanes around the world would have to answer to the U.S. So what happened after a very cheap Iranian mine blew a very large hole in an American ship, the U.S. decided to do kind of a measured retaliation, which was to go and attack 2 Iranian oil platforms. They really attacked them. It was very. They ended up in flames. The people on them evacuated, and some had to jump off onto tugboats, and some jumped off and floundered around in the water for hours and hours.
And you talked to some survivors, if I remember correctly.
I talked to both Americans who were on the ships that were doing the bombarding, and I also talked to Iranians who were on the oil platforms. And that's what gave that chapter kind of an interesting twist, is that it looked one way from the Americans' point of view, and then, of course, a very different way from the Iranians. But what was interesting then is that the Iranians started firing back American weapons at the Americans. So they were firing Harpoon missiles, which the Shah had purchased, at the Americans. And that started this giant war, basically a one-day battle. And it remains the largest battle since World War II, the largest naval battle since World War II.
Oil on the brain literally takes us around the world, as we're finding out. And it takes us to important, exotic, and strange places. None stranger, perhaps, than the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. We'll visit that place in Texas when we come back.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Follow us on Twitter at JimFosterCoc or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
Lisa Margonelli is the author. The title of her book is Oil on the Brain, Adventures from the Pump to the Pipeline. It's published by Doubleday, and it's a Nana Talese book, which always, in my experience, means quality. And I always congratulate authors if they've worked with Nana Talese. And Barbara Ehrenreich had something nice to say about the book. Oil on the Brain, she says, could be called the petro-economy for dummies, especially hardcore dummies like me, who insist on being entertained as well as educated. From the corner gas station to the oil fields of Nigeria, there couldn't be a better traveling companion than Margonelli. She's fast, fearless, funny, and a brilliant observer. But one of the not-so-exotic places you went to is Texas, near the Gulf of, or just off the Gulf of Texas. And it is, the reason you went there is because it's the site of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. And when did that start? Right after World War II, didn't it?
No, there's another strategic, I think, a naval petroleum reserve that started after World War II, but the actual Strategic Petroleum Reserve started after the oil embargo of 1973.
Oh, okay. Now, one of the first things we learned about this place, it's not easy to gain access.
No. Quite difficult to gain access. I had to call, and finally I ended up talking to someone at the Department of Energy, the PR man in charge of the project, and he said, well, there's nothing in there but pipes, and no one ever goes in. And I said, kind of ludicrously, I said, well, I really like pipes. At that point, I just wanted to keep him on the phone, and eventually he let me in, and they made big. It was very nice. They brought me in, and I got to spend an afternoon in there and see how the place worked a little bit. But of course, it is true. There's really nothing there but pipes, because all of the oil is stored in big underground salt caverns, and you can't see any of it.
And however, it does have a bit of a staff, and you met some of them. And after meeting them and discussing what they were doing, you said, in short, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve is the Boy Scouts gone mad. They are always preparing to be prepared. Oh, why do you say that?
You mean the slur against the Boy Scouts?
Yes.
Well,
the Boy Scouts are going to send me letters, I bet you. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve has never, it's been used in very small amounts in small kinds of crises. It's never been fully used. So they spend a lot of time checking the pressure in the caverns and thinking through possible contingency plans that never ultimately have to be used. So they just spend an enormous amount of time with flowcharts and flowcharts that lead to other flowcharts. This sounds like the father of Homeland Security, doesn't it?
It is.
Now, one of the places near home that you went to is Carson, California, down in the Long Beach, L.A. area. Mm-hmm. And there you are getting a tour. The reason you went there was to get a tour of a refinery. And you're right. At around 10 a.m., one of the refiner's generators went down while another was being repaired, leaving the unit without backup electricity. A 3-second power dip hit the substations to the hydrocracker, and its pumps and compressors lost power and shut down. That was when the unit alarm went off and all the workers started filing out. That, in turn, shut down the hydrogen plant, which produces hydrogen and steam, and the butane and the pentane units. Refineries run on steam. Without it, a refinery stops. Chemicals stop flowing, and things start to go wrong. The pressure began dropping across the whole system. Thanks for stopping by.
Yes. In fact, before I went into the refinery, I had to watch a video that had all sorts of safety things in it, and one of them was what the unit alarm sounded like, and I thought, oh well, whatever. And then, of course, there I am, and there's the unit alarm going off, and there's all the workers filing out past us. And there's flare, the flares went off overhead.
Yeah, the flares, that's the warning of malfunction.
Right. So the flares went off, and then everyone was filing out, and then we turned around and left, and then, by half an hour later or so, things were kind of back on the right path, but it was, I don't think I made that happen.
But I have the sense they're probably not going to invite you back.
Actually, they're not unhappy with it.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that. I'm glad to hear that. On a further trip to Texas, you met a fellow by the name of C.D. Roper, and we don't have enough time to chat about him in this segment, but we will when we return.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Follow us on Twitter at Jim Foster COC, or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
This is Jim Foster. We're talking about a book called Oil on the Brain, Adventures from the Pump to the Pipeline. And we're talking to the author, the fearless, the always ready for the new challenge, Lisa Margonelli. And Poe Bronson says, Oil on the Brain is hugely enjoyable, compulsively readable, and brilliantly reported. Now, he had a great fear when he was starting to read this book. I feared reading a book on oil would be akin to being told, eat your carrots. But from page 1, Lisa Margonelli made oil into brain candy and kept it so till the end. I like that. Now, let's talk a little bit about this Texas guy, C.D. Roper, a fourth-generation oilman, who says that he's lost $200,000 so many times it seems reasonable. That's Texas talk, ain't it?
It is. Yeah, he'd spent his whole life in the oil industry. He'd grown up whenever his dad and his uncle and his grandpa were heading out to rigs that they were investing in or knew people who were working on them. He'd always go hide in the back of the truck and to get out there. He loved the way it smelled. That's one of the things that people who really really are into the oil industry, they love the smell of petroleum.
Oh, wow.
I know.
Okay.
But he was somebody who, he'd grown up around drill bits, and he'd grown up looking at what the drill bit brings up, which is not only oil, but lots and lots of old sediments going back, more than 100 million years. Mm-hmm. And he could tell you where you were in the history of Texas at almost any point if you just showed him a bit of the sand or showed him what were called the wireline logs, which is they send kind of electrostatic sensors down the well hole and they test the resistance of the different strata underground. And so he just was really intimate with those areas.
In the area of geology, the guy, absolutely brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. You end the book with something that came to me as a bit of a surprise, talking about the next 50 years. And one of the things you say is we need many fuels in the next 50 years, not just one, as we try to move toward energy that is both economically and environmentally sound. We need to question whether the innovations of Oil City, the cars, the corporations, and so forth, are still working to our advantage. Are they giving us the strategic flexibility we need? What are you thinking about there?
Well, I think that the oil industry was the first great modern industry, and it really has influenced everybody from Walmart to everything that came after is influenced by the big vertical structure of the oil industry. And but we also have and they deliver oil to us daily, and they never screw up. I mean, this is one of the amazing things, is they never screw up in terms of getting it to your local gas station. So, and they've done that by growing very big. And in the U.S., we tend to have a sort of an oppositional attitude towards them, particularly in places like San Francisco, of saying, well, it's a conspiracy or they're monopolies. But I think that as those monopolies have essentially worked in our favor by bringing us very cheap oil very regularly. But we're going to, and not to say that they're completely monopolies, they're actually in a lot of competition with each other.
Sure.
But as we go forward, we need to sort of question everything. We need to question whether our cars could be radically more efficient. We need to question whether our government is too biased towards energy supply and not enough interested in limiting energy demand. We need to question whether we need just one fuel like gasoline for all the vehicles, or whether we should have some vehicles running on one fuel and some vehicles running on another fuel. We have to question basically everything as we go forward.
One of the things you say in this section, which is really interesting, the first gusher was in the ground, but the next gushers may be in our brains. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think that when we first found oil, it was by drilling down into the ground at 69 feet below the ground. A huge gusher of oil, shot out. That was in 1859, and that started the oil age. But I think that the next sources of oil are things that we have to think about. We have to look at parts of our economy and say, how could we make that more efficient? One of the big inspirations is the refrigerator. In 1973, the refrigerator used 1,800 kilowatts of electricity, kilowatt hours of electricity. And now they use more like 300 because they've become so much more efficient. But their price has also fallen. And if you remember refrigerators in the mid-'70s, they had to be defrosted and they would break all the time, and they don't do that anymore.
That's right.
So pressing them to be much more efficient has really given us much better refrigerators and much cheaper refrigerators.
Well,
and
you've
given us
oil is. You've given us a much better way to think about oil and oil companies, gas, and what the future may be, because you've written a book that's very entertaining and tremendously informative. Oil on the Brain, Adventures from the Pump to the Pipeline. Lisa Margonelli's the author. This has been Conversations on the Coast, and I'm Jim Foster.
Follow us on Twitter at Jim Foster COC, or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.